I think the bigger harm is not necessarily always the supplement itself. You really just have time and money to lose, and, that's it. But it's more like, what are we not addressing if we just look at some solution that's really not getting at the underlying problem here?
That's the Washington Post's Ask a Doctor columnist, Trisha Pasricha. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Don't forget to hit that follow button to get new episodes of our show every week. And if you find this conversation or any others you've heard valuable, I have a favor to ask you. Consider leaving us a review so we can keep bringing you more of the conversations that you love. If you don't know, here's how to leave a review. On Apple Podcasts, go to the Everyday Better page, scroll down to ratings and reviews, and click the number of stars you want to give us. And then right below that, click write a review and add your note to our team. On Spotify, you can go to our page, click the 3 dots next to the settings wheel, and select Rate Show. We so appreciate your feedback, and as always, thank you, thank you, thank you. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts who use science and story to share strategies for how we can flourish individually, in relationship to others, and to the world around us. As regular listeners of the show will know, I've recently gone through one of the biggest changes a person can experience in life, becoming a parent. I am obviously so excited to share that I'm a brand new mom of a beautiful baby girl. And while I'm adjusting to my new life as a mom, I'll be taking a little bit of time away from the show so I can be fully present for her and my family. Don't worry, you'll still hear me in conversation with a fascinating guest each week, just like you always have. But you'll also be hearing from my producers, Grace and Emily, on a more regular basis. They'll be stepping in to set a little bit of context for each of my conversations. So with that, let's start the show.
Okay, Emily.
Yes.
How much would you guess the wellness industry is valued at, just in the U.S.?
Ooh, okay. Billions, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to guess like 200 billion.
Okay. So the answer is $480 billion.
Wow.
And just to put that number into perspective, that's how big the entire creator economy is expected to be by 2027.
Oh my God, wow.
And I was thinking about this.
Yes.
And I was like, maybe we shouldn't be surprised because wellness encompasses so much. Like, it's really everything from alkaline water to red light therapy to snail serums to collagen supplements.
Totally. And I don't even consider myself to be a true wellness girly. And I wonder how much money I've spent in the past year on all those things, on skincare, on protein supplements, things like that.
Well, so I was going to ask you, because I am famously not on social media, I sometimes feel out of the loop on this stuff. But you do a better job of keeping abreast.
I am chronically online, yes.
Of health and wellness trends. So just out of curiosity, what is big on your social media right now?
Right now, a lot of my content that's wellnessy would be about morning routines. That's huge right now. And I will say the last time I think I fell for a wellness trend, this summer there was this big thing called the Sleepy Girl mocktail. And it was cranberry juice and bubbly water and then magnesium. And you made a little cocktail to kind of make yourself sleepy at night. And I bought all the things. I don't know if it really made me sleepy, but it probably had a placebo effect at least.
No, that was big. I mean, that trickled down even into my ecosystem.
Oh, wow.
I remember that one this summer. And this is the point that I want to make, which is that I think probably 95% of the wellness trends that we're aware of are born on the internet, right? They're popularized by and then often marketed to us, consumers, by influencers, not by doctors.
Right, which is why it's so hard to tell if you're falling for just some wellness trend and you're a sucker, or if this stuff is actually rooted in science and is going to make you feel better.
So glad you asked. That's why today we are joined by medical journalist and Dr. Trisha Pasricha. Trisha's a neurogastroenterologist. That means she studies the gut-brain connection. And she writes a column for the Washington Post called Ask a Doctor. And that's what we're going to do today.
We had so much we wanted to ask Trisha, so we actually are going to have her on for 2 conversations in a row. In this episode, Trisha and Leah get into health misinformation, why there's so much of it, especially in recent years, and why there's so much conflicting information online when it comes to our health. Trisha also talks about the most common questions she gets from readers and what those questions tell her about what's actually on people's minds. As we were putting this episode together, we also put out a call to listeners for their most pressing questions about health and wellness. So in the second half of the show, Trisha will be answering your questions. We're getting into leaky gut, seed oils, continuous glucose monitoring, and more.
Okay, before we start the show, I just want to add that I loved this conversation because it's really much deeper than just a fact check of some buzzy health topics. I think Leah and Trisha are really getting at what's going on underneath the surface of these fads. So why they're so popular and what that says about our larger fears and goals when it comes to our health. Okay, let's start the show.
I got into what I'm doing. So I'm a medical journalist. I write the Ask a Doctor column for the Washington Post. I got into that work when I was in college. I started writing for CNN. I did internships at ABC News, even as I was studying to be pre-med and became a doctor. So I always knew I wanted to have some role in the media. But things really crystallized for me when the pandemic happened in 2020. And I had been at that point a little bit out of the media for some time because I had been sucked into medical training, as one has to do. But it was a time when I was really struck by how wrong things can go when we don't communicate our science well. And so we were seeing all of these different stories that came out during the pandemic, some of which were very science-based, and then some which had this like slight kernel of truth that had some nugget of science in it, but were backing an entirely irrational intervention or proposition or healthcare policy. And it was scary to me as a doctor and as a scientist to see how wrong not the science was, but that the way we communicated it could be and how the public perceived that science. And then there was a lot of mistrust in what the scientists and doctors were saying. And that whole experience and just seeing how harmed people could be by that misinformation is what motivated me to say, you know what, maybe I should try to be a voice of somebody who has had experience in distilling complicated subjects into something that people can understand and try to convey that in a way that's doesn't dumb it down, because I think people don't want to be spoken down to and they want to know the facts. They want to know what is the primary resource, but in a way that's relatable and engageable and doesn't get totally lost in the jargon. And so I started writing more and more about topics that I was hearing about where I thought there was some misinformation. And eventually the Well and Being editor at the Washington Post asked me to join the team. And I was so thrilled to do that. And it's been really wonderful since.
You know, I think there's a really positive thing about the fact that we have more access to health-related information as the public than we've probably ever had before. That also means we have access to a lot of misinformation and or like it's like a game of telephone that by the time you get to your TikTok or, Instagram post from so-and-so who says they're an expert, you're hearing, like you said earlier, like a kernel of truth and then a lot of other stuff around it. But I do think, and I'm sure this is a big part of the reason they asked you to join the team at the Washington Post, that we are hungry for information that used to feel like it only belonged to a certain set of people, and that was our doctors or scientists. I'm curious, what kinds of things are you hearing from people who just want to know about health and want to be able to live well?
That's it. You're making all really good points. I think just like the country and the way we convey science has really changed. Medicine has changed a lot as a community too over the last several decades in terms of how we're even just talking to patients, right? Like in the 1950s or even earlier than that, there was really this idea that a doctor would talk down to their patient and they would tell them, this is what you need to do. This is the right thing for you. I'm going to tell you what's good for you. And that was culturally accepted. And for a long time in this country and in many countries, it's still the case that what the doctor said was the final word, and they accepted that. And in medicine, we've shifted in how we talk to patients. It's no longer, we're telling you exactly what you need to do. It's more of a conversation where we try to understand what your values, what your goals are, and here are what the options are. And we kind of have this shared decision-making process. And I think the same has to be true of how we communicate medical advice and science to the public. If we simply tell people, look, this is what we know to be the right thing, we leave it without a lot of context. We say, you just have to trust me. I'm a doctor. Then people are, I think, rightfully can be a little skeptical. Even if what you're saying is the right thing, is the thing that if someone knew all of the details about it, they would agree that is what I should be doing for my health. If you just give it to them as like a top-down kind of approach like that, people don't take it the same way as they would have maybe in decades past because we're different. And the world, the way we communicate changed. Social media is a big part of that. And so I think what I hear from a lot of my readers who write in and certainly from my patients is that they love the fact that what I write is never really a hard and fast, here's what you always have to do. And here's always the right choice, and here's the absolute wrong choice. It's usually, that's true of anything in medicine. There's usually some gradient. And I always try to give people the primary resources to go back to, but really in my own text or in the reels I make on Instagram, I try to give context to the studies, because if someone wants to go back and read the studies, they're welcome to, and they should if they're capable. But at very least, I give them the context that I think about with those studies about, well, here's what I think is the flaw of this study, and here's what I think is the real benefit of the study.
I love that, number one, you're talking about the gradient. It also makes me think about talking about what's true in the moment based on what we know in the moment, where I think a lot of people, if you're not maybe steeped in the medical world, in the moment, you believe that whatever information we have now is the right information and don't necessarily realize that in 20, 30, 40 years, that information will probably change. Even for your column, it's you may look back in 25 years and go, oh, remember when I thought that? Because that was the opinion and that's what was coming out in the journals, and now that's changed. Can you talk about that a little bit too?
That's a classic tension in my world in medicine, and I think for anyone who's in science journalism. But I think the important thing is that you just try to convey to people some sense of vulnerability of yourself as a scientist, as the doctor, or as the writer of this information, that, you don't know the answer all the time. Sometimes I invite readers to write in questions, and my answer is that I don't know. The answer is that the data is not good enough to answer this question. That doesn't mean I don't answer it. That doesn't mean I throw that question out the door. I answer it and I just tell them, this is what we know. This is what the science tells us. And here's what we still need to do more research on. But I think allowing yourself, which is new, I think, in our field of medicine, where the doctors show vulnerability and the writers show vulnerability, we always ask our patients to be totally vulnerable with us. Tell us everything about, your entire medical history, anything embarrassing, just tell us. You've just met us, but tell us. We never show that side to our patients, but I try to, at least in that regard, in my column, which is to at least, let people know when I feel like the science is not there yet. And I think it's okay to change your thinking about something. I've changed my thinking about a lot of topics in medicine from when I started my training back in medical school to today. So much has already changed. I think as long as we're open with people about why we thought the way we did, why new information has made us change our mind, I think shouldn't be looked at as anything other than improving trust in the people rather than something that erodes trust. Being able to change your mind and sharing that, I think, actually is something that would make me respect a writer or a doctor a little bit more.
Are there other kind of trends that you see with Ask a Doctor right now that people are really focused on? And I'm curious what you make of those trends.
There are lots. We get questions from all kinds of trends that you'll see on social media. I think in broader categories, supplements are probably the main question that we get when it comes to a healthcare trend. People we love our supplements. And like I think I read like 1 in 3 Americans is taking a multivitamin, for example. And that's probably one of the most popular supplements, but people are taking collagen supplements for their skin. They're taking magnesium supplements for sleep, and they're doing lots of different things that involve popping a pill. And, I've written a lot of different columns that kind of dive into individual supplements and then just broadly about like, what does this all mean? And I think my short answer is that there are certainly a few places, a few scenarios where people have certain medical conditions where a supplement makes total sense. There's good data behind why you would need this and the benefit you would get from it. For the vast majority of cases, the data is not very good. It's just not very good. And that doesn't mean that supplements are harmful per se. And I try to tell people that it's all a risk benefit analysis. A lot of the time, you're not harming yourself. Some of the time you are. And it's that some of the time that I worry about. So situations where the supplement that you're taking is not actually helping your health, but it interacts with some other medication you're taking, and that can have a problem. And we see that show up in our clinics and hospitals from time to time. Sometimes I've had patients who spend so much money on supplements that they actually like don't want to spend the money or just are not able to spend money on the medications that are prescription medications at the pharmacy that they need to pick up. And I think that's a really unfortunate and tough situation. And then sometimes I think people take supplements because they're trying to redeem some deficiency in their diet. And they think that, well, let me just take this multivitamin and that'll make up for it. And there's really nothing you can do that can make up for a poor diet. No supplement is going to do that. And a lot of the studies, for example, in magnesium, that show that there's a benefit to increased magnesium intake, that's all increased magnesium intake in your diet where the benefit has been nicely shown. It's really never been the case that taking a magnesium pill has some profound, large health outcome in a large population. There are some mixed studies, and we can talk about like specific scenarios about sleep. The data is a little bit mixed there. But really, if somebody is worried about a particular nutrient, I usually tell them, what are the nutrient-rich foods that you can eat that can kind of balance the diet? Why don't we go back to what we're eating? And I think that's the best way. And the reason for that is that when we eat foods that are nutrient rich, they're never nutrient rich in just one thing. You're bringing in often a lot of positive different nutrients into, if you eat fatty fish or you eat a lot of fiber, diverse vegetables, you're getting a lot of different nutrients at once. And probably that's why those studies show that there's an important benefit that isn't there when you distill it down into a pill into just one particular nutrient that you supplement with.
Got it. And so I hear there are some times where it can do harm. I'm also curious, do you have any information on whether or not some of the things that we're doing or taking might just be like a placebo effect? So, for example, magnesium, right, with lowering stress and rest has been a big thing. And I've heard a lot of people at an influential level talk about this is actually a great thing to do. Here's the magnesium you should take and all of that. Do you see that that's real, or do you think a lot of times we are creating the benefits because we're taking this little pill?
You're diving into a really fantastic subject. The placebo effect is very complicated. And I think the superficial way to look at any study is to say, well, if this supplement is no better than placebo, then throw it out. It's not doing anything for you. It's actually probably much more nuanced than that, in the sense that it may be no better than placebo, but it's there may still be a biochemical change that even something that's not bioactive in the way you think it is still producing some change. Maybe it's in your central nervous system or otherwise that's having the effect you want. I think what I worry more about is that we're starting to ignore and not really seek treatment from a healthcare provider about the underlying cause, about why we're having trouble sleeping in the first place, right? Because we're saying, okay, I have trouble sleeping. I'm going to go online and on TikTok, and I'm seeing that magnesium helps, and I'm going to take some, and maybe it does help, and maybe you do sleep 15 minutes longer. I mean, literally, this is how long the studies have shown, and some people might be like, 15 minutes, that's not that much. And yeah, I don't think it's that much, but that's what at least, it is. But I worry more if that you then kind of say, okay, I've sort of solved the problem, or I have this thing that I'm going to experiment with on my own for months to years. And this whole time I had sleep apnea, which actually I needed to get treated. And there's all of these negative health outcomes by not getting that treated, that I'm not addressing because I found the answer online, or I found something that I think is the answer to the problem. So that's actually the thing I worry more about. And I see this a lot with people who take like iron supplements. They're like, I'm fatigued. Let me just try an iron supplement. I heard this can help. And like maybe it does help. But why are you so fatigued is what I want to know. And what are we missing medically about this? And so I think the bigger harm is not necessarily always the supplement itself. You really just have time and money to lose, and that can be big enough for some people. But it's more like, what are we not addressing if we just look at some solution that's really not getting at the underlying problem here?
I mean, and I will say, I think like as a kid, I was always told, like, listen to your doctor, but always question. I think there's in disadvantaged communities and communities of people of color, there is more of probably, I'm maybe guessing at this, but there's more of a distrust of things like this, right? So of doctors, and that comes from obviously the history of how we have been treated or what we've experienced. And so I've had times where I've gone to the doctor and they've asked me if I was stressed. And when I said yes, the answer was like pretty quickly, do you want a prescription medication for stress? Oh. And so you're like, well, I left there going, well, I definitely don't trust you, Yeah. And so there is, I really do. I think there's this tension again between autonomy and listening and trusting that can be difficult. And so I wonder, I don't know if there's a perfect solve, but I wonder what the solve potentially is for people who go, well, I just can't put all my eggs in that basket. While you're saying, don't just go off and run your own experiments, without having any information about what's actually happening.
Yeah, you've hit on maybe the heart of our entire problem in medicine. And this is really near and dear to my heart. In my, I write this column for the Washington Post, but in my clinical practice, I'm a neurogastroenterologist. I always tell my patients, the most important thing is to have a trusting relationship with your doctor. And that often takes time to build. But if you're not getting that in your first visit, maybe you give them another chance. You have a second visit. If you feel like you're being dismissed, or your gut is telling you there's more here and they're brushing you off, I think you should find another doctor. And I tell people that's not easy, right? Like I've tried to find other primary care doctors. Like it's hard to get an appointment.
I
right?
don't know why, but yes.
We have the system's broken on so many levels, but get another doctor, right? And there would be no scenario. Like I'm often somebody's second or third opinion myself. I'm never offended if somebody wants to get another opinion, to just hear what one of my colleagues would say. In fact, sometimes I learn new ideas when my colleagues see some of my patients and have a new lens. But I often find it's helpful to, instead of just talking about the symptoms, to just ask the patient, what are you most worried about in general? Because sometimes people have certain symptoms, but what they're really worried about is they say, well, my dad had stomach cancer. And actually this whole time they're really worried that all of these symptoms they're talking about lead back to cancer. But that they wouldn't have said that unless you had really asked, well, what is the underlying concern here? And sometimes once you get it, what is the underlying worry that's going to bother you when you leave that room? You might not have asked about it, but that's the thing you're going to think about. If the doctor never knows that, they're not going to be able to kind of help you address that specific question. And you're going to leave sort of feeling like, well, still nervous, still upset, right, still not having that answer really given to you.
Coming up, should we all be paying more attention to our cortisol levels? Are seed oils actually bad for you? Trisha's getting us the answers. Plus, she explains why her take on continuous glucose monitoring has changed. We'll be back in just a few moments. And we're back with medical journalist Dr. Trisha Pasricha.
I'm going to move into some audience questions because we have some good ones of stuff that I know you've heard and gotten questions about that are like trendy things. First trend I want to ask you about is leaky gut. Is this a thing? And what is it?
I love that you asked that. Leaky gut, or I should say that the scientific term is increased intestinal permeability, is a very real thing. And that's actually something I study. Neurogastroenterologists like myself have been studying for years. we've been studying what happens to when those tight junctions in the cells of our intestine open up a little bit. And that's called increased permeability. So permeability meaning molecules and small particles can move across the intestinal barrier. That is a real, actually normal phenomena that happens to all of us all during the day, every day of the week. It's sort of the term leaky gut, I think, got a little bit hijacked by social media and is taken to describe a set of symptoms that people are ascribing to increased intestinal permeability. And so a lot of people have symptoms like bloating, discomfort after meals, maybe brain fog. And it's become this diagnosis that these are two symptoms that actually don't meet in the middle. The description of leaky gut, that exists, and then there's these symptoms, but these two things don't actually have a causal relationship, at least as of what the science has told us so far. And that's the case for a lot of different medical conditions where there's an association with increased permeability. But if we just stop at leaky gut, the truth is that there's no treatment for it. There's no medically approved treatment for it. And so you can really go down this rabbit hole of people will, I've seen these videos on TikTok of this cocktail of supplements is going to be what you need, and you often end up going down these routes when, again, you come back to my concern about all of these types of trends is that what are we really missing medically? And especially when those things that we're missing medically, we might actually have good treatments for. We just don't get to them because we're getting lost in this sort of hype about a leaky gut. There are things that we know that the science has really shown well that can increase your intestinal permeability. Like I mentioned, stress, acute stress does increase intestinal permeability. And that's a whole separate conversation about how stress can connect to GI symptoms. And that's a very real and well-studied pathway. But things like alcohol use can certainly do it. NSAIDs, so that's like ibuprofen, Advil, Aleve, these types of medicines can compromise your gut lining. If somebody's really worried, I do tell them, well, here are all the things we know that can damage your gut lining. And they're the things I mentioned. And eating ultra processed foods is another one that can damage your gut lining. If you want, cut down the alcohol, try eating whole foods and see how if that improves things. Sometimes it does. And that's probably not necessarily just the leaky gut. It might be related to if these people have irritable bowel syndrome and what the effects of all of these different things do on kind of our whole bodies and not just the lining. But if you've tried all of these simple kind of measures that you might hear about online and it's not doing for you what you want it to do, it's really time to talk to a doctor who trusts you and who believes you and is not going to just say, oh my gosh, you're talking about leaky gut, I don't want to have this conversation. Then you need a different doctor. But someone who just, wants to explore these symptoms with you and get to the bottom of it. I would encourage people to try to talk to a doctor earlier rather than years later of suffering and getting nowhere with some of these online treatments.
Okay. So Carly asks or says that she's heard cortisol is really bad, first of all, and that high intensity workouts are also then really bad. So I'm curious if you can comment on maybe those two separately, because cortisol I feel like is a really common conversation right now too.
Yeah. To take them one at a time. So yeah, cortisol has been very trendy. A lot of people write in about this. But, cortisol, also known as the stress hormone, it gets this bad rap because it gets linked to inflammation. And when the word inflammation gets thrown out there, people say, my gosh, this has to be really bad for you. Inflammation is the cause of all kinds of problems in our lives. It's linked to cancer. It's linked to cardiovascular disease. So cortisol, that word really scares people. If you just go back to medical physiology, though, cortisol is present for a reason. There are moments where the body needs to produce even a short-term stress response in order to sometimes just fight an infection or to wake yourself up in the morning and just go about your daily life. That is not necessarily so bad for you. In fact, it's just part of how we live and how we fight off problems that attack our body. There's a link that starts to get made on social media and online about, well, then these are foods that increase your cortisol, and then these are pro-inflammatory foods, and they're linked to increased cortisol, and that can take you down a real dark path that doesn't really lead anywhere where the science is. But I think some of these other things that you might hear about, things that raise stress in general, lifelong stress is not good for you. And high levels of stress have been linked to bad cardiovascular outcomes. I think if we're talking about ways to reduce our stress, that's only a good conversation to have. Sure. And that will only help your almost any aspect of your health. If we start focusing specifically on some lab value like cortisol, which is part of this much larger complex network of that stress regulation pathways in our bodies, we're going to miss the bigger picture, and we're going to be chasing a number that is not a direct correlate with these health outcomes that we're worried about. So I think my short answer, and in the bigger picture, is that cortisol can be good and bad. It just plays a normal role in how our body functions. And the thing that we should be focusing instead on is just how do we reduce stress in our lives? Because that's the main thing that has important cardiovascular or cancer or other health outcomes that we should be worried about.
Got it. Kyle wants to know about continuous glucose monitoring for non-diabetics. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this I've done a lot of research on. So continuous glucose monitoring, the idea is that people who have diabetes have been using continuous glucose monitoring for a very long time. And it's very helpful to get this kind of minute by minute almost track of what your blood sugar is looking like, and then use that information to decide, well, how much insulin do I need to give myself? So it's been very effective and safe for years in the diabetic population. Recently, people without diabetes have started using them mainly to track their own blood glucose levels, and with the idea that tracking what your glucose levels do might help you make more healthy, informed decisions about how you eat, how you exercise, how you move during the day. That idea itself, I think, is not inherently so awful. I find that most of the information you could glean from a continuous glucose monitor, you could learn just by reading about how your body works. And you could learn about what are the things that spike my blood sugar and what are the things that help have a more continuous release. Like, you and I could know right now that if we were to eat something like a piece of birthday cake, that's going to have a different effect on our blood sugar than if we were to eat something high in fiber, like some whole grain piece of toast. The whole grain piece of toast is going to have a much more slow, steady level of glucose release over time than the quick spike we're going to get with something that's more densely packed with glucose, like a piece of birthday cake. I think sometimes just hearing that kind of information from a doctor or reading about it, the information doesn't stick as well as when you see it play out in real life in your own life. And so for that reason alone, if someone's like, you know what, for 2 weeks, I'm going to try this blood glucose monitor and just see how my own individualized decisions affect it, I think it can be a little powerful. You can say, for example, one study found that people who go for a 15-minute walk right after meals, they tend to have lower spikes in their blood sugar. And I've had patients who said, like, you know what, like when I watched that happen, I watched what happened when I ate a meal and I took a brisk walk afterwards. And then, I ate a meal and I just kind of sat on the couch and I was a little bit of a potato. I saw a big difference even with the same meal. That really motivated a change in their behavior, much more than me saying, make sure you go for a walk after your meal. It's really good for you.
Careful with that birthday cake.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And even though the information didn't change, the advice didn't change, seeing it in your own real life, I think sometimes can be that extra trigger. And I don't think that that's so bad. In fact, I think it can be very helpful. And this is something that I had as I mentioned, I change my mind sometimes on different trends in science and depending on the data. And this is one where initially when continuous blood glucose monitoring started to come out as a health trend for people without diabetes, I was like, this is really nuts. Like, this is like taking this thing that people with diabetes really need and it's like has a clear purpose and just applying it to a broad population how do you interpret all of that data and how do you make something helpful out of it? But as I started to see how, maybe just using it in the short term can be so motivating for people, the harms are pretty small. I think that's okay. I don't tell people to use it for like more than 2 weeks. There is this sort of like longer term group of people who have had them on for years. They use them for a long term. And if I ask them, well, what did you learn this month that you didn't know a couple months ago? I rarely find that people are getting new insight from them. So I think you get some bang for your buck in the beginning if you need it. But I think after a while, you end up just paying a high premium to keep them on. There's like just a very minor risks associated with them, but not profound. So my short answer to continuous blood glucose monitoring is that if you're somebody who's maybe got pre-diabetes, or you have some other reason that you're worried about your own glucose control, and you're just struggling to internalize some of the messaging around it, I think it might be motivating to see what happens in your own body for 2 weeks with the experiment. I don't think you have to use it much longer than that. And I don't think you'll get much from using it much longer out of that.
I like that advice. And I myself have been curious about continuous glucose monitoring just to see. I like the experimental part of it and just to go, oh, got it. That's what happens.
But now I know.
Yeah. To your point, it's like you probably don't need it for very long before you're like, oh, now I really get it. Okay. So then Amy asks about seed oils. Do you have anything to say about that? I think that's been circulating a lot. Like, what do we, seed oils, vegetable oil, how impactful is that in our health?
Yeah, I think seed oils has become the new thing. I don't know why, that has gotten, it's become like a bad word, I think, online. And, I think seed oils, it's something that even the American Heart Association can say is part of a healthy diet. I think it's not as bad as we think it is. When people talk about cooking with seed oils, so seed oils are things like canola oil, for example, or grapeseed oil and things like this. People aren't drinking them. We're talking about putting a little bit into your cooking and you maybe sauteing your foods with them. I think it sort of depends on what you're using seed oils for and what you might be substituting them for. And so for example, if you're using seed oils instead of saturated fats, which would be like animal fats, like butter, for example, you're cooking your food in seed oils instead, I think you're actually making a healthier choice. If you're eating highly processed packaged foods, like a lot of these snacks that you can pick up that are prepackaged have seed oils in them, then I would say you're maybe not making such a great healthy choice. And that's often the mode in which we get a lot of seed oils is in these ultra processed foods. In that scenario, though, I think the seed oils are part of why those foods are unhealthy for you, but it's a lot of other things. It's all of these kind of components that get entered into the food through ultra processing. So it's hard to pin the problem on seed oils alone. But I think if you're using seed oils as part of your, a variety of foods and ingredients you're using, and you're sauteing your vegetables in them, or maybe you're, using them lightly on your fish, and that's what you're using instead of using lard or butter, I think you're making a good choice for yourself. None of these things should be used in excess, and you can look up what the kind of recommended amounts are through the national guidelines. But I tend to find that when we villainize something like seed oils, that often people are just using it small quantities as a substitute for something worse, then we might create an even bigger problem. And then people will say, well, let me just go back to butter because I know what I'm doing there. Or maybe olive oil is not an option because sometimes that can be more expensive. I think it's a little bit of weighing the risks and benefits and asking yourself, what am I using seed oils for?
Okay, so I just learned something new because I've been like, oh no, I'm going to use butter. And literally, I'm like, I've been a seed oil naysayer since I heard about it. And I'm like, oh, got it. I made up in my mind that if I got a special kind of butter, and I think I saw it somewhere that if you do this butter's actually not that bad.
And I hate to, I too, I don't like saying, oh, this one food is bad.
Sure.
This one food is good for you. And I think that that's true of butter. It's true of lots of different foods that we eat. Good health is just, it's the sum of the numerous daily micro decisions we make over a lifetime. Somebody who has one glass of wine every couple of months to celebrate or to have a nice time, it's very different than somebody who drinks 3 or 4 glasses of wine a week. And so we all have to make these small decisions about the benefits and the cons in our daily lives that I can't make for you, your doctor can't make for you. Nobody's going to tell you this one thing, this one time you have butter, or even these multiple times you have butter in your omelet, because who doesn't love that is the thing that's going to be so awful for you. But just know the data. Just know that the data exists, that there's this X% of increased risk of cardiovascular disease if somebody has this amount of butter over their lifetime. And that's just a number to think about if you really want to. But I sometimes tell people that doesn't mean never enjoy yourself. You feel bad if you ever decide to have that slice of great birthday cake. You shouldn't do that. It's about a habit rather than, something that you do to feel good or to enjoy a moment with friends from time to time.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting, right? Because you hear about like the risks being increased, but you also then hear the stories of like the family member who, ate ultra processed foods for their whole life and drank alcohol their whole life and lived to be 99 and was fine. And so you kind of like, again, I think it can be difficult to distill like, okay, what's the right thing to do? But we're also talking about like many factors that impact, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually something that comes up a lot in the comment section of my columns is like people saying like, I'll lay out some set of advice based in with what the risk kind of percent changes are with making certain changes in your habits. And then you'll get all of these comments that say like, I did none of these things. And like, I feel great. And I'm in my 70s and that's wonderful when that happens, but I think of almost any health outcome. It's like you're stacking these blocks up over time in your life. And at some point you hit some threshold over which if your blocks, cross that threshold, you get the disease. And some people are just born with more blocks stacked up than other people. They're born in situations where they have genetics that are working against them, or they grew up in environments where they ate a lot of ultra processed foods, or they had environmental exposures, which they had no control over. That was just how they grew up. And then they do all of the right things that they can recall. They exercise, they eat healthy, and they still get the disease. And you say, why did this happen? Like they did all the right things. It doesn't mean that the dietary advice is wrong. It's all about some percent risk change. It just means that we're all different and we all are coming to this disease from different places. And that's why everyone has to make that calculation for themselves. Like, am I happy taking this risk of 18% increased cardiovascular disease because drinking red wine every week is my favorite thing to do and that's what I want to do? I'm not going to say, my God, you're an awful person for making that choice for yourself. I don't say that to people who smoke. I don't say that to almost anybody who's making choices. We're all adults. I'm here to inform and help you get on the path to health, however is feasible to do that.
When I think about the reason that these social media posts or people who are, have expertise, they say, are sharing things. And the reason they pick up so much steam, even the reason that people love your column is like, we're all trying to, I think, control for something, right? It's like, ultimately, we all don't want to get sick. Like, that's really the thing, right? It's like, we're all just trying to keep from getting sick because we want to be, we may want to live a long time, but we want to be healthy a really long time. And we want to enjoy our lives for a long time. So I think that's part of it. And then the reality is we could have blocks stacked against us. So like there is also some openness to that where I think people can get into this like anxious feeling of like, how well can I be? How much control can I have? And it feels like, based on what you just said, you could have two people, one who does everything right and still, gets some illness or some chronic illness, whatever it is, and another who doesn't do everything right and doesn't get it.
Yeah, that's the toughest part of being a doctor. I think of being in medicine is you see this all the time. And I think in my column, I try to be very careful in my column and as a doctor about never using language that would make somebody feel like blame is being assigned for an outcome, right? Like I think sometimes you'll read these stories about a celebrity maybe who gets diagnosed with cancer or something awful, and they'll be like, well, they used to smoke, right? And it's like, that doesn't mean, first of all, like smoking increases the risk of cancer. But then you'll meet 100 other people who didn't smoke and get cancer, and we don't blame them either. And so I think everybody's coming at it from a different place. And that's like sort of the difference between equity versus equality. Like we're starting at different places here and blaming people for these outcomes. More importantly, blaming yourself when you have a bad outcome and saying, oh gosh, if only I had not had cake last week, I wouldn't have had this heart attack. I don't know if that's really it's hard to assign blame to yourself. I think all we can do is do the best we can over time. And it's really that over time question that becomes more important than just like one individual choice at one moment.
I mean, I love that point. It feels a lot more open than like this is good or this is bad and you should or shouldn't be doing this, because ultimately we also live in a world where we're constantly being marketed all of these things. even in like all of these questions, it's funny. I feel like, Trisha, it's like it's so easy to get lost in all the different advice, and you're trying to like put all the pieces of the puzzle in place and going, okay, so what do I do? Like, what would you say our focus should be on when it comes to our general health?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the theme I come to in my column and I tell people is really cliched, which is that, you know, these trends and these commentaries about what's good for you and the science changes about like 20 different things, but the real basics about how to live a healthy life haven't changed in hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And I think it's really hard to hear your doctor say, well, eat more whole foods, exercise 3 times a week at least, you know, but don't smoke. By the way, don't smoke. Like that's like, if there's anything, if there's an absolute, that is the absolute, but it, you know, there's some nuance there. But, those are the things that I think, just coming back to the basics of our health, there hasn't been controversy about that. And even though it's the simplest, the oldest, most boring, annoying message when your doctor tells you to do those things, those are the things that we often like really haven't done at the point when we're starting to add in a lot of other supplements and monitoring our glucose and trying all of these other interventions that are sort of skirting around the fact that we just don't get enough fiber in our diet, you know, like, or the fact that we're not as active as we want to be, or we're not working out 3 times a week. We're not getting 30 minutes of moderate to intense exercise. If we simply go back to the basics in terms of eating a healthy, balanced diet, high in fiber, exercising, avoiding smoking, minimizing alcohol, I don't know that we need to do 100 other things to try to circumvent what we've done with just some of those basics. So I guess that's we're all in.
Well, that concludes our part 1, Dr. Pasricha. We're going to come back next time, and I want to talk to you about how we think about the medical field, how people can become better researchers. You know, I'm putting that in quotes, but, you know, researchers when it comes to understanding trends instead of just, you know, jumping onto them, but actually going into why this is, what this is. How do I read a study? You know, how do I take in this information? So I'm excited to do that, because I think the next part is really about empowering people.
I can't wait. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.
That was Dr. Trisha Pasricha, medical journalist and the Washington Post's Ask a Doctor columnist. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The show is hosted by Leah Smart and produced by me, Grace Rubin.
And me, Emily Reeves.
Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. Tim Boland mixes our show. We get additional support from Alex Kutzniat-Sova and Ali McPherson. Sarah Storm is our senior producer. Enrique Montalvo is our executive producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Maya Pope-Chappelle is director of content and audience development. Courtney Koop is head of original programming. And Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. Thanks for coming with us, and we'll see you next week.